Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Fleet Green, and I'm the superintendent here at Lake Clark National Park and Preserve. I know many of you here, and it is good to see your names and see your faces before we actually get into the summer season here, where I usually see more of you on the beach at Lake Clark than from my office here. So, but it's nice to get started. So I'll be starting us off today. You will see a couple of other speakers as well. Our pictures are here, so I'll start. And then I will turn it over to Sarah Bodo, who we have from the National Park Service Denver Service Center. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Bodo, and I'm a project manager for this coastal management plan, and I'm honored to be here today.
And then the other speaker today will be Alex Mackey. Alex, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. If you're a commercial operator, you probably know me, at least by name. I'm the Commercial Services Program Manager for Lake Clark, and with my staff member, Cinnamon Dockham, we manage the portfolio of commercial operation authorizations for the park. Nice to see everyone.
Great. And then we have several other of our park staff on the call who you will see later to help answer any questions that people might have. So we have Greg Coons, our Visitor Resource Protection Manager, Liza Rupp, our Cultural Resources Program Manager, Buck Manjapane, Natural Resources Program Manager, and then we also have Sharon Kim from our regional office joining us today. And we can go to the next slide. So like I said, welcome everyone. The purpose of this meeting is, you probably saw in the announcement that the park is launching a coastal management plan for the park, and this is tiered off of our general management plan and our general management plan amendment, going into greater detail and depth just for the Lake Clark coast. And I want to emphasize that we are very much at the early stage of development of this plan. We put it out for public comment because we want to hear your thoughts. Over the next, there's about 15 days left, and then we will take those comments, come back around probably in the late fall and go out for public comment again. And Sarah will talk more about the process moving forward at the end of this presentation. I do want to highlight, we are not taking formal comments on the plan during this call. We will have question and answer period at the end, but we encourage you to submit your comments online through this portal, web portal highlighted at the bottom of the page here. And then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah just to do some navigational aid during the meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several ways that you can engage today. So first of all, there's a camera icon somewhere on your screen. Feel free to be on or off camera. We love to see your faces, but also understand if you don't want to be on camera. As far as your microphones, it looks like everybody is keeping themselves on mute during the presentation. We really appreciate that, just to reduce background noise. And when we get to the Q&A, if you are calling in by phone, and I see at least one person is, you can press *6 to unmute and remute yourself, and we'll call on you just to check in and see if you have any comments or questions for us. Some other things that you should be able to do in this Microsoft Teams program is type us questions or comments in the chat by clicking on that chat icon. When we get to the Q&A, you can also raise your hand and lower your hand, and we'll make sure to call on you. And then at any time during the meeting, feel free to choose a reaction icon. You know, they're all very positive reactions. We'd love to see those. I also want to note that the presentation is being recorded so that anyone who misses today will have an opportunity to watch it. We anticipate sharing the recording and posting it on the project website sometime next week, and we'll announce that by email and social media as well. I also want to add that Birnbaum Interpreting Service is providing real-time captioning. So if you would like to use this captioning service, please click on the link that we will provide in the chat now. Let's see. I'll click on it, make sure it's working. I saw our captioner joined a little bit recently, so hopefully that's going to get started working. Yep, it's working. And also for accessibility purposes, we will be describing images on the slide. So if you hear us doing that, that's why we're doing that. All right. So today we have a presentation sharing the initial ideas that the National Park Service is considering. Following the presentation, we'll hold a question and answer session. The presentation should take about 40 minutes, maybe 30 to 40 minutes, and that should leave us with plenty of time to hear your questions about the effort. So this slide contains an outline of today's presentation, and we'll start with an introduction to the project. After that, we'll summarize the issues that we are trying to address. Then we will share some initial potential solutions that the National Park Service is considering. Then we'll share the planning process and timeline. And finally, we'll share how you can provide feedback on the plan, and we'll have that informational Q&A period. Feel free to pose questions today in the chat or verbally. And we hope that you'll focus your questions specifically on this planning effort. We'll answer those to the best of our abilities, and we'll plan to adjourn the meeting by 3:30 p.m. Alaska time at the latest. And after that, if you still have unanswered questions, please pose them as comments on the project webpage. So let's see. So we really do encourage you to provide comments. We're thankful for the folks that have already commented. So if you're one of those folks, thank you so much. And on this screen is a photo of Chinitna Bay and Iliamna volcano. And with that, Suzanne will now provide the park introduction.
Great. Well, and here again, we have a lovely beach photo from the park with some grass there in the front and a log and Chiswick Island in the background there. Starting off, though, at a real high level, why we are here today. So we, as National Park Service employees, are charged in implementing the park purpose. And this language here is mostly derived from what Congress intended when it designated Lake Clark a national park in 1980 through the passage of ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, as the purpose for the park. And in particular for the coast, if you go back and look at that section out of ANILCA, you will see references to the volcanoes, the scenic beauty of the two mountain ranges, and the charge to protect habitat for brown bears. Other species as well, but again, related to the coast, in particular brown bears. And so, like I said, over the years, as we have developed different planning tools, including the General Management Plan and the General Management Plan Amendment, we have tiered down in our specificity. And so we often do district plans. And so this coastal management planning effort is really another tier off of our general management plan and other plans that the park has developed over the years. And we can go to the next slide. So I often tell folks that not any place gets to be a national park, that it is a very special place that gets designated as a national park. And certainly Lake Clark is one of those places, and the coast, we all know, has really amazing resources. And so when we think about the park significance, it doesn't take very long for a visitor or a resident Alaskan to really understand how special the resources are from this place. Again, the viewshed resources, the natural and the cultural resources, as well as what they encompass in terms of the experiences that people have when they're along the coast, the stories that they hear, the sounds, the quiet, and other attributes. So all of those things will be considered as we go through the planning process. And we can go to the next slide. So what is the scope of the plan? There's really two ways to look at this. I think there's the time scope. And when we develop a plan, first, it takes significant resources. We have been trying to secure the financial resources to do this planning effort for over 2 years now, and we're very lucky to have the support from the Denver Service Center as well as our regional staff, but it does take time and money to get one done. So we don't get to do them that often. So when we do them, we really have to look out 15 to 20 years from now and try and analyze the data that we have of what has already occurred and project out what could occur and make sure that we build into this plan the flexibility so that we can really employ adaptive management going forward as things change, so that we can be nimble to, again, meet that mandate that we are charged with by Congress. The other way to look at the scope is, again, the geographic scope. So this should be no surprise to most of you that we will be going from the northern boundary along the coast of the park into Tuxedni Bay, and then down south to our border boundary line in Shenitna Bay. I did want to highlight on this map, though, that there are a significant amount of private parcels and private land within that boundary, and so the plan does not affect those private lands, whether that is individual parcels or parcels owned by mostly Alaska Native regional and Native corporations. Certainly those hashed areas that you see up around Tuxedni Bay and then somewhat down in Shenitna Bay are those different Alaska Native village and regional corporation lands. We also recognize that our boundary line is the mean high tide line. So our jurisdiction goes to that line, and then state jurisdiction starts below that line. So this plan will only cover that area that is within our jurisdiction. I also want to highlight that if you want to get greater detail on this map, and I think in particular understanding where those private lands are, you can go to a mapping device that is on our website, and we can highlight that and drop it in the chat for all of you that might want to dig a little bit deeper into that. And then the last thing that I want to highlight on this map is just what is designated wilderness and what is eligible and ineligible wilderness. So you'll see the brown is the designated wilderness, the gray is ineligible, and then the yellow is eligible. And these lines were changed in the General Management Plan amendment to clarify, especially on the coast, what is wilderness, what is not wilderness. And so that is something that we will also be taking into consideration as we move through the planning process. All right, we can go to the next slide. So again, what is the project purpose here? It is to develop a coastal management plan to improve visitor experiences at key coastal sites while protecting resources and responding to changing conditions. Next slide. Key issues. So what are some of the key issues that we hope to address in the plan? And I want to say some of these are data-based. Some of these are also just things that we have heard from Alaskans, from the public, from visitors, from commercial operators over the years of things that they are observing, things that we're observing, that again, as we look out 15 to 20 years, we want to make sure that we are considering and putting forward for the public to comment on potential solutions. So this picture here on the left, you will see a number of planes sitting on the beach there. And then on the right, you will see a bear approaching some visitors. having a once in a lifetime experience, I am sure, seeing brown bears on the beach. So Alex will talk a little bit more on the first bullet, but we have seen a large increase in the number of visitors to the coast over the last decade. And certainly, even since we did amend the general management plan in 2013, we've seen a significant increase. And with that comes challenges that we think we do need to talk about, discuss, and potentially put solutions on the table. And one of those challenges is the potential for bear-human conflicts and the stress or the behavioral changes that that stress brings to coastal brown bears. And Buck can talk more about that as we move into the question and answer period. And we can go to the next slide, please. Few other key issues that we hope to address. We are a growing park. I always tell folks we are still fairly young compared to most of the parks in the national park system. And so that does mean that we still have inadequate visitor facilities and amenities. So what you see here on the left-hand side is one of our viewing platforms or viewing areas at Chinitna Bay, with the open area there on the ground and a few wooden benches that visitors go to view bears in the meadow there. And then the middle photo is of the newly installed outhouse at Silver Salmon Creek. And then on the right-hand side there is an airplane flying over the meadow at Silver Salmon Creek as well. So we are looking for input on what visitor facilities the public would like to see and how we accommodate visitor use as it continues to increase. What are the needs there that we can address? The other one that we hear about a lot is limited aviation guidelines and the visitor safety impacts that come from that. All of you know the challenges of flying in Alaska, and especially that is true with our limited aviation weather forecasting on the coast, challenging weather, and just the distance from Anchorage and the Kenai Peninsula across to the Lake Clark coast. So another thing that right now, again, we have limited tools in our toolbox to address, but something that we need to discuss. Next slide, please. And then we also have just limited personnel on the coast. We have the 2 ranger stations at Chinitna Bay and Silver Salmon. So you see our ranger station cabin there at Silver Salmon Creek. We typically have 1 ranger there for most of the summer. We try and augment that as best we can in the heavier use months during the summer, but typically it's 1 person. And then we have our Chigmit, our park vessel that does limited patrols along the coast. And I would say over the last 4 years, we've really tried to get more trained boat captains for the Chigmit so that we can do more patrols. And that has really helped. And I'm really proud of the work that our staff have done to utilize that vessel. And we've seen some of those less frequented areas on the coast more often to really understand how this visitor use at our heavier areas is spreading along the coast. In the middle there is a picture of one of our rangers, Diana Lyles at Chinitna. And I love this picture just because it shows, again, how we get things done on the coast. So she is hauling a log there on her ATV to get up to our ranger station at Chinitna Bay. And then in addition to our interpretive rangers that we deploy to the coast in the summer, we have significantly increased the research being conducted along the coast. So this top right picture is a clam survey being done that we've done for the last 2 years, and we will continue this summer, which is great in that it does have more Park Service personnel on the coast and observing what is occurring there, but their primary purpose is research. But we don't have enough housing on the coast to accommodate everyone. So that's something that we need to consider. And then the last picture here is an aerial photo of Tuxedni Bay and Chiswick Island, and we don't have any presence in Tuxedni Bay right now. So that is also something that we are considering, what will occur in terms of visitor use in Tuxedni Bay over the next 20 years, and how do we make sure we are prepared to staff up that area if that's a recommendation that comes out of this plan. And then another issue that I want to highlight, of course, is climate change. When we think long-term, we do have to consider what climate change will mean to both the natural and cultural resources on the coast. Right now, when we look at modeling for the next 25 to 30 years, what it shows, and I'm sure everyone will be very excited by half of this, is that temperatures will warm year-round, but we will also see more precipitation. I know over the last couple of summers, it's hard to imagine even more precipitation, but that is what the models forecast for us. So what does that mean in terms of the resources? It could mean changes in the meadows. It could mean changes to the ability for people to access the coast. It could mean earlier runoff and warming stream temperatures on the coast. So therefore, what does that mean in terms of the salmon habitat and the brown bear habitat? We need to think about if 25 years from now, these resources, the habitat has changed, what is that going to do to some of the primary species that we were charged to protect in ANILCA? All right, next slide, please. So I am now going to turn it over to Alex, and she's going to dive deeper into these visitation changes that we have seen.
Thank you, Suzanne. So as I mentioned at the introduction stage, my name is Alex Mackey, and I'm the Commercial Services Program Manager for Lake Clark. Between myself and my staff member, we manage the 3 contracts that are in the park, in the preserve, as well as 130 commercial use authorization holders. So we have activities that range in a myriad of services that are provided to visitors. We have air taxi operations, which provide transportation, boat trips and charters, which also provide transportation because our park is not on a road system. You either have to get to it via flight or via water travel. And most of our visitors do not have that at their fingertips. So they often have to work with a commercial operator to access our parks. We also have a number of guided activities that are authorized under a commercial use authorization, or CUA as we call it. We have a lot of guided bear viewing, photography instruction, guided sport fishing, as well as guided hiking, backpacking, kayaking activities, to name a few that are seen throughout the park and preserve. One of the other things that my program is tasked with is collecting visitation information, and that's because so much of our visitation is commercially supported, and we do require that our commercial operators report the visitation that they facilitate in our parks. So over the next few slides, I'm going to delve into some of the changes in visitation along the coast that we have seen over the last 15 years. This first slide, you'll see a graphic that shows the overall annual visitor use days by location. And I'm going to do a little defining here. So the visitor use day is what we use to understand how much visitation the park is receiving. So a visitor use day is calculated through our CUA reports mostly. And we do that by looking at the trip basis of how many visitors over how much time, along with any guides associated with it, are occurring at these points in time. So as you can see in the table, I have it broken out into the 4 locations that are being discussed under this plan over the 15-year time frame. And in all cases, there has been an increase in visitation, most noticeably in Chinitna Bay and Silver Salmon Creek, though also we are seeing increases in visitation in Shelter Creek and Tuxedni Bay. It is a little hard to see what that visitation really looks like for those last 2 areas, because in comparison to the first 2, it's on a completely different scale. So as you'll see, Silver Salmon Creek and Chinitna Bay have seen the greatest increase in visitation in the coastal areas. going from not even 1,000 visitor use days to now, in the case of Chitinitna Bay, over 6,000 visitor use days last year. And something to also remember is our visitation season is so short. We're not seeing year-round visitation for the most part. We're seeing it really captured between the months of May through September, with the bulk of it actually in that 3-month middle period of the summer. So when you're looking at this, you really have to remember what the time frame really is when we're talking about annual visitation. Let me just make sure I'm not forgetting anything that I want to talk about this. So visitation data that we've gathered from our commercial operators, it shows that we've gone from an annual visitation along the coast of 1,500 visitor use days to almost 10,000 in 15 years. And that's pretty significant. It's a 550% increase along the coast alone. So very significant. And in that time frame, we're not seeing an increase in staffing that keeps pace with it. So when we're thinking about these key issues, visitation really plays into each and every one of them. I also want to mention that while Shelter Creek and Sydney Bay look like there's almost no visitation up until 2021, there was a little bit reported occasionally from our operators. And then in the last few years post-COVID, we have seen quite a bit of growth in that visitation, with a few hundred visitor use days versus the few dozen we were seeing in the years preceding them. Versus the Silver Salmon Creek and Chitinitna Bay, we've seen a much greater visitation increase, going from 800 visitor use days to 4,000 to 6,000 annually in the past 5 years. And that's, of course, excluding COVID. And while we did see a visitor use day drop in 2020 due to COVID across the board in the National Park Service as well as Lake Clark, those visitation numbers had almost completely rebounded within a year to the 2018 numbers, which 2018, 2019, both of those years had broken records in terms of visitation. And then with this crash, we've now come back from that completely and are exceeding that along the coast. Now, I do want to mention that this is really focused on our commercial visitation, the graphs I'm going to be showing you, and that's because Lake Clark's not on a road system. We don't have an entrance station where visitors are driving through, and that collection of private visitation can be collected along with commercial visitation. So we do know that this is not the entire picture. We do estimates of private visitation, and we get a lot of that information from our on-the-ground rangers who are there and do collect information and then provide it to our program. Next slide, please. So this next slide is breaking it out by monthly coastal visitor use days to really highlight where we're seeing that bulk of visitation occurring. So you'll see over the same time period, 2009 to last year, 2023, the months of May and September have remained relatively flat, but have overall still increased over that time frame. While you're looking at the months of June, July, and August have really increased in the amounts of visitation in 15 years. For instance, while June used to be a less visited month, it's now almost keeping pace with the month of August. We've seen quite a dramatic increase in how many visitors are coming during that month, and what used to be a peak is now expanding in length. Additionally, I also want to mention that while we used to see visitors arriving the last week of May, sometimes not until the first week of June, we're now seeing that time frame also moved up to coincide with mid-May. And this might have a lot to do with cruise ships are also now starting to come to Alaska a little bit earlier and a little bit earlier. So we're starting to see our visitation to Lake Clark happening a little bit earlier. And our staffing is not keeping pace with when they arrive and are able to be there at the same time. I also want to mention it is hard to see because our peak months are so much higher in visitation than those shoulder season months of May and September, we have seen a pretty significant increase even in those shoulder season. So for instance, for May, we have seen about a 700% increase over that time frame in visitation from 2009 to when we saw the peak in 2022. And for September, we also have seen a 200% increase over the past 15 years from 2009 to the peak of last year. And then in terms of our peak months of June through August, we were seeing visitation of about 1,300 over that 3-month period in 2009. And last year we had 9,000 visitor use days reported for that same period. So very significant increases. And as you can see, once again in that graphic, a drop in 2020, and then by 2021, we were keeping pace with 2018 numbers across those months for the most part and exceeding it past that. Next slide, please. So I have 2 more slides I'm going to talk about, and this is talking about the changes in visitation and the primary purpose that our visitors are coming to these coastal areas. And the reason there's going to be 2 slides is because, as you can see from the graphic, we have one activity in particular that far exceeds the next 3 most popular visitor services that our visitors are coming to experience on the coast. And that most popular one is, no surprise, guided bear viewing. Our bears are world-renowned. People see them on magazine covers, on the television, these amazing creatures walking in close proximity to our visitors, and a lot of visitors are coming in droves to see them. And the reason I have another slide after this is to then just also show in a more applicable way the next 3 visitor services and how they have varied over that 15-year term, because it's really hard to see when compared to bear viewing and the units that come across in that. So as you can see, we have seen a really significant increase in guided bear viewing activities. In 2019, we were seeing a little over 1,000 visitor use days over that May through September timeframe. And last year we had reported right around 9,000. So very significant increase in a 15-year term. And then just looking at how steep that trend is, it was flat for a couple of years, and then a modest increase, and then another large increase, and then flat. And then between 2016 and 2019, we really saw a takeoff in visitation for bear viewing activities. And then following COVID, it has rebounded and exceeded that. Next slide, please. So in this final slide, I did mention that we're going to talk about guided photography instruction, air taxi, and guided sport fishing, which are the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th most popular activities on the coast. I do want to say that we do have other activities that are allowed on the coast and do take place, but they're in such minimal amounts that I did not include those on this slide because it would have still been very hard to parse out how those changes have occurred. So just wanted to show that we have had increases in all these visitor services, with the exception of sport fishing, where we saw a peak in 2011, and then it went back to those 2009 levels and have kind of remained stagnant the last few years. Versus air taxi operations, which has seen an interesting cycle of peaks and valleys. And then, of course, 2020, another very big drop, but then now it's starting to creep back up again. And then finally, guided photography instruction. We have seen some fluctuations as well, but overall an increase, except for last year. And one of the things that I think is a little confusing sometimes is understanding how is guided bear viewing different from guided photography instruction, and the way the park has seen it, and we've tried to more clearly define it as well in our applications for our operators, is that a photography instruction is really about teaching a visitor how to capture an amazing photo. So it's like a really much more intensive process versus guiding and looking at the bears with them and giving them more of a sense of security while having incidental photography. Because of course, if you see a bear, you're going to want to take a picture. So that's how we differentiate it. So there might have been a little bit more of a restructure in how operators were were labeling themselves and categorizing themselves in reports. And that might be why we saw a dip in 2023 when overall visitation really has just completely increased from 2022 to 23. So as I mentioned, this increase in visitation is very deeply connected with the rest of the key issues. And I'm going to hand it back to Sarah to talk about some of the potentialities the park is looking into and how we can handle these key issues.
All right, thank you, Alex. Very interesting and informative. So now let's transition from the issues that this planning effort aims to address to turn to potential solutions. So the potential solutions on the next 5 slides were developed by the National Park Service team. And I do want to stress that they are initial ideas and we're calling them prompting ideas. So prompting for you all to react to, really. We really look forward to hearing your thoughts on them and other ideas that you may have that we may have missed. And we do anticipate that these potential solutions will change as the planning process proceeds and before any decisions are finalized. So the next 5 slides are grouped by the issue that the solutions primarily address. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight a few of the bolded potential solutions verbally. You can read the full ones here on the slides or in the newsletter that is on the project website. So this first grouping is in response to the issue of the large increase in the number of coastal visitors. So some potential solutions include work with commercial operators to identify solutions for reducing the number of groups in view at one time. Another idea is to manage visitation by either limiting the number of commercial use authorization holders and or transitioning to concession contracts for the coast. Another idea is to monitor cultural resource sites for visitor impacts at key locations, and then of course take action if that monitoring is showing some impacts. All right. I'll move on to the second issue. So the potential for bear-human conflicts and impacts to brown bears. And just highlighting a few. So the first one I want to highlight is an idea for a solution is to improve the consistency of best bear viewing practices on state and federal lands. So consistency on state and federal lands. Another potential solution is to work with commercial operators to improve bear viewing practices. And another potential solution is to establish a distance requirement between visitors and wildlife. All right, moving on to our next issue. So this is the inadequate visitor facilities and amenities. Some potential solutions include offering accessible opportunities wherever possible. Specific to Chinitna Bay, an idea is to address human waste concerns by adding another outhouse. Also at Chinitna Bay, considering opportunities for a visitor contact area. And we can talk more in the Q&A about, what those ideas might mean. An idea for Silver Salmon Creek is, again, to adjust human waste concerns by adding an outhouse at Silver Salmon Creek. All right, moving on to the issue of limited aviation guidelines. So one potential solution is to facilitate conversations with pilots about best practices at the specific sites. And then finally, for our issue of limited National Park Service presence on the coast, some of the ideas include, number one, examining facilities on the coast and determining what improvements or additions may be needed to facilitate increased staffing. The second idea is to provide information for staff, commercial operators, and the public about protection of sensitive sites and resources. And another idea is to explore opportunities for partnerships with adjacent landowners. So again, as I only highlighted some of the potential solutions, please feel free to read them all in the project newsletter that's available on the website. And that covers the initial prompting potential solutions. We really do look forward to hearing your thoughts on these ideas. So let me transition now to a few last slides, this and one on the planning process. So we've divided this planning process into 2 phases, and we are currently in phase 1, which is we're calling foundation and problem analysis. And this really involves gathering background information, identifying issues and goals, and seeking your input. So this phase will continue over the spring and summer of this year. And as you know, the public comment period is open and is running now through early May. And after that, the planning team will consider, your ideas, any new strategies, changes to the strategies based on your feedback. So starting in the fall of this year and continuing into early 2026, we'll be entering into phase 2, which we're calling the decision-making phase. So that will include the planning team drafting a management plan. You will also have another time to provide input during review of that draft plan in the summer of 2025, approximately. And following that comment period, the National Park Service will aim to finalize the plan, with the overall project expected to be completed in the spring of 2026. And following that, the National Park Service would start to implement some of the strategies. Now, I do want to note that most of the strategies in this plan would not be implemented immediately. Action would take place as funding, staffing, and other park priorities allow. And this planning effort really is a long-range plan intended to be a roadmap for the next 10 to 20 years. So it's going to take many years to complete, and it will result in incremental change over time. All right. That brings us to the most important part of the meeting and the reason we're speaking with you now, which is your role in helping with the planning effort. And we really do want to hear your thoughts and ideas on the ideas presented today. So this information that you share with us will really help inform decision-making and priority setting for public investments over the next decade and beyond. Today, we will be using this time for your questions and for clarifications. Just wanted to let you know again that we want you to provide official public comment on the website or by mail. We won't be taking official public comments over this meeting. That will just help us, analyze and respond to your comments efficiently. And thank you to those who have already submitted your comments. So when you click on the link that I think my colleague just put in the chat, you'll get to this homepage for the project website. And to get to the submitting your comments, you'll have to click on that link that says open for comment, and then you'll click on the newsletter, and then it'll take you to a form where you can submit your comments. I also want to note that unfortunately, we recently learned that this project website will be down for 4 days, starting tomorrow around noon your time, and through Monday in the afternoon. So because of that, we have decided to extend the comment period for submitting comments. So the due date was May 2nd, but we've extended it to May 6th. So that gives you a little bit of extra time and an extra weekend. All right, so this slide shows the new date of May 6th. Again, shows the link. You can also provide comments by mail, and my colleague, I think, just entered this address in the mail or in the chat for if you would like to use that. I also wanted to note that we aren't taking official comments by email, so please use one of these methods. All right. Well, this concludes our presentation, and now we'll transition to our Q&A session. So first, to describe this image, there's a bear in this beautiful photo in the foreground at Silver Salmon Creek with trees and a mountain in the background. And my colleague, Wes Mize, will be our moderator today. I also wanted to note that here with us online are other colleagues from the National Park Service. And I will ask that employees of the Lake Clark Park and Preserve, if they could turn on their cameras so that folks could see you. Feel free to ask questions of any one of the staff here. Again, I'd like to invite you to ask questions in one of two ways. Feel free to type questions directly into the chat, or if you want to use the raise your hand icon, or you could just raise your hand physically, we could probably see it. We'll call on you to unmute your mic and ask a question. And we might bounce back and forth between chat and verbal questions, and then we'll also ask for folks on the phone if they want to unmute and speak up. And I would like to encourage everyone to please use considerate language, listen to each other, and just be concise, just so we can hear from as many as we can. And really that we are listening, and we're really hoping to understand your thoughts and any concerns and to answer questions. So with that, I'll hand it over to Wes to moderate this Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you all for joining us today. First question comes in the chat from David and Joanne Corey. This is a question for you, Suzanne. David and Joanne ask, could you explain further your thoughts on barren fishing platforms at Silver Salmon?
Yes, I sure can. And hello, it's nice to see both of you. So this is something that we have heard over the years, and it's a question of whether or not for the platforms, and by platforms, what we really mean is bear viewing areas. So similar to what we have at Chinitna Bay, not a platform like what you might see at Brooks Camp. That this would be an area where there are some, small benches, a cleared out area from the grass, sort of even footing. And I think in particular, thinking about the accessibility needs of some of the visitors coming to the coast. As you know, we have wheelchairs with those beach wheels on them, and that's proved to be very popular. And we've gotten requests from visitors that we expand the accessibility of the area. And so that might be a way to do that. At Chinitna Bay, we have 3 of those viewing areas. They do get crowded at times where there'll be a queue back at the beach of being able to access it. So we've also heard comments requesting that we add additional viewing areas at Chinitna Bay. So by platform, that's really what we're talking about, is that kind of cleared viewing area with small amenities, maybe an interpretive panel, again, like we have at Chinitna Bay. In terms of a fishing platform, this is one that we've heard as well, not quite as sure how it would work, but given some of the erosion along the banks there at Silver Salmon, whether or not that is something that I think could be installed in a sustainable way given the tides. And again, if it would add additional accessibility for some visitors. I think that one is a little trickier to think about how it could be installed, but as a conversation prompt, I think it's worth talking about.
Yes, David, go right ahead, sir.
There was some reference made earlier to the mean high tide being the jurisdiction line between Staten and Park. And I know some years back there was some research and data gathered to that end. And I just wonder what the if that study was completed. Is there a definitive definition that we can go by now in terms of just what constitutes the division between state and parkland?
Yeah, I think the answer is soon, but not quite yet. The data has been collected. The contractor has done their work, but it still needs to go to NOAA to be officially blessed and uploaded. So we are hoping that that is completed soon and something that we can remap so that you have a visual of it, and possibly even have someone from park staff go out there and walk it with a number of the operators so people have a better understanding. But Buck, I'll let you answer further if you want.
Yeah, I think you encompassed it quite well, Suzanne. So, David, just, it's one of those things. I think now it's a little bit out of our hands in terms of the next step, but that being said, it's something we're going to follow up on. I know it was a important thing for us to determine. I think it helps all of the operators and certainly gives us a better feeling for where our jurisdiction is. So I think that's something I'm looking forward to reaching out to them this summer, and I'll certainly report out and let you know what I find out.
And I see that Greg's hand is raised too. Greg, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to also remind folks, or for those that may not be aware, that process is to determine the current tidal epoch, which happens every 18 and a half years. So the effort that's going right now is probably some new data collection techniques to feed into that, but it is something that will occur again in a couple of decades and again after that.
And one thing I'll just jump in here, that we don't talk about that much related to climate change, but again, is something to consider as we look to the out years, is the uplift. So as glaciers recede, there is uplift. We have not seen it that significantly on the Lake Clark coast yet, but we know that it will occur. It's been more dramatic other places around Alaska. But I think that is something to also consider in terms of potential habitat changes on the coast. And our inventory and monitoring team has been looking at it. And as part of this planning process, we will add more information in about potential impacts of climate change to the coast.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Buck. Thank you, Greg. David, does this help? Would you like any additional clarification?
No, thank you. That's good for now.
Thank you, sir. Are there other questions out there? I see Bill Moorwinkle's hand went up. Bill, if you'd like to jump in,
thanks.
please.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I was just curious, in looking through the issues that you have stated, I was wondering if there was anywhere that we could find either research or studies or data on a lot of the issues that you addressed there, specifically like human bear incidents, salt marsh meadow impact, human and bear impacts, including with OHVs, like the human waste impacts, and yeah, that kind of information. So when I'm forming my comments and opinions on that, I could do it a little bit more educated.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will turn to Buck for at least the human bear incidents in particular. I think many of you have seen Buck and his team over the last several years, again, really increasing the amount of research that we have been able to do on the coast. So Buck, why don't I turn to you for that first piece?
Yeah, so Bill, I'll kind of do my best to answer this question as effectively as I can. In some cases, bear-human interactions and negative bear-human interactions, we're somewhat dependent on those being reported to us. We certainly hear about some and take documentation of those, but I would say there are many cases where an incident could be classified as so, and we don't get a record. So I will say we're probably a bit deficient in that data, but we certainly are seeing instances. Certainly those of you that follow social media certainly see instances of kind of bad bear viewing behavior and bad responses by bears to some of that. And so we certainly see some potential there. I think as we expect visitation to continue growing, our expectation is, that may increase. And so we just want to be a little proactive. On another front, in relation to bear stress, we did do some work, I think it was 2 summers ago, on our coast looking at bear stress response. And so we were looking at fecal samples and cortisol levels in those. And the results of that study are in. We actually have submitted it for publication at this time, and it should be if all goes well, published by this fall. I can give you kind of a brief synopsis of it. So essentially, we looked at kind of our two major bear viewing areas, so Silver Salmon Creek and Chittenden Bay, and then we looked at Shelter Creek, which has a much lower level of visitation. And among those three, we actually didn't see a significant difference between them. But what we did see, and was really kind of noteworthy, is that at Chittenden Bay, where we have our meadow closure in place, we actually saw a lot higher level of variability, so kind of more extreme reactions. And I think some of what we looked at there and tried to tease out was what might cause that. And the one factor that I think we were led to believe might be most responsible is, this meadow closure where we don't have people in the meadow, bears are pretty free to move and react to one another. But once they leave the park boundary and end up on what is the adjacent state lands and the mudflats, there's a very different bear viewing experience out there. So I think the bears were presented with very different interactions with humans over the course of a day. And certainly that kind of lack of predictability has an impact. I think we know, there's a fair amount of literature out there that shows bears can become really tolerant to things that they repeatedly are exposed to. And so if there's consistency there, you really reduce the potential for that stress. And so I think what we're really hoping to do with this, and I think a lot of the focus on the best bear viewing practices, is to ensure that those are in place and that they really occur broadly, and so that bears don't experience this kind of variation in their interactions with people, so it can be predictable and lessen their stress. So hopefully there'll be more information coming out about that soon, and I'm certainly happy to share it as much as I can at this point with you if you have further questions. Hopefully that covered most of it.
And then a couple of the other things that you mentioned in terms of ORV use, I would say we have seen some issues over the years, especially at Silver Salmon there, in terms of erosion down into the creek that has made travel up that bank more challenging. And we did quite a bit of work last summer to try and address the rutting. It was a very wet summer, but if there is something else that we can do to try and stabilize that area, it's something that we want to consider. And then also, I just want to make clear, we did a whole process around the trails at Silver Salmon Creek several years ago, not looking at making a change to that trail system. But in some particular areas where we can improve the maintenance. And again, as you dip down into the creek there, that's one. We also have seen a few accidents, both at Silver Salmon and Chittenden Bay, from vehicle use. And so what we can do in partnership with operators to try and improve safety around that vehicle use. We all know that it's a remote area and emergency response is not always easy. So what we can do to really have a proactive conversation around improving safety. And then the last one that you mentioned is the human waste impacts. And I'll turn to Liza here in a minute, but this, as we have seen increasing visitor use and the digging of cat holes to deal with human waste, what that means for a coastline that we know in places is very rich in cultural resources, but we have not been able to survey the entire coast. So, and that could take decades, frankly. Again, it depends on financial resources coming from the federal government to help us do that. So the money is not coming as quickly as maybe we would like to really do a comprehensive survey of the coast. So we need to ensure that we are protecting those resources in the meantime. So does that mean things that we have already implemented in terms of requiring people to pack out their waste, or again, installing additional outhouses? I never knew when I came to the Park Service how much I would be talking about outhouses, but we are, and it's important to address some of these concerns. But Liza, is there anything more that you want to say in terms of the cultural sites and digging of cat holes?
I don't think so. I think you gave a very good summary. Yes, there's a lot we don't know still about the coast and its cultural resources. We have been able to get Jason Rogers, our archaeologist, out there. He did some work last summer, but as everyone here knows, the weather on the coast is challenging, and he and a coworker were able to get some work done, but were unable to make it to Shelter Creek last summer because of the weather. So there just remains a large portion that we don't know anything about. So yeah, Suzanne's exactly right. We're just worried about what we don't know. And so if we could mitigate that by providing better facilities for everyone, that would be great. And protect the resources at the same time.
Bill, do you have any clarifying questions? Does that help?
Yeah, it helps a little bit. And one question I was wondering, I know the issue with the OHV and erosion on the banks and stuff. I was more interested too in the interaction of bears and OHVs, if there's been any studies on that.
I will turn that one to Buck.
Yeah, there, to the best of my knowledge, and there certainly could have been, we have not conducted any. I think in most cases, the levels of use and predictability of use, bears tend to become pretty habituated to that. So in most cases, I think there's pretty low level of impact to bears. Certainly if people go outside of those bounds and maybe speed in certain areas, or catch them in an area where they may be surprised, there's certainly a chance to surprise them and create some issues. But I think in general, for our areas, we haven't necessarily seen that as a huge level of impact. I think more of the impacts have been related to kind of the environment itself, and rather than bears specifically.
Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Buck. So our next question comes from Oliver in the chat, and then I'll move to David Cardinal, who is raising his hand. Oliver asks, explain the campground. Oh, I beg your pardon, everybody. Oliver asks in the chat, explain the campground idea at Silver Salmon Creek, and please address the concern of limited NPS staffing and offering something that will increase the non-guided visitors and potential bear and human conflict. And I believe that question too would best be addressed to Suzanne.
Yeah, sorry, that was a little bit hard for me to hear. So let me just pull up the chat so I can read it as well.
Of all the times for my dog to have a meltdown, right now it's not the best time. But I can ask it again.
No, I got it here in the chat. Don't worry. Okay, explain the campground idea. Okay. So I will say, over the years, we have gotten more frequent visitors coming to Silver Salmon and frankly, Chitinita Bay as well, looking to camp. And we do not have a campground. So it just poses the question. I personally do not particularly want to camp near bears, but there are places, parks in Alaska that do have designated camping areas to improve visitors' safety when you're in bear country. So that is just a question that we are posing. And then in terms of the limited Park Service staffing, I think, again, as you know, Oliver, we typically have the one ranger at Silver Salmon and the one at Chitinita, and typically late July and into August, we try and get an additional ranger there, particularly a law enforcement ranger. Hiring law enforcement rangers is getting more and more challenging. So we have had less ability to do that over the last several summers. I am hoping that will turn around. But it is something that, like you say, for non-guided visitors in particular, it would be helpful to have more presence there by Park Service staff in general. So I hope that answers your question, but that is where one of the ideas came from, is just we have, and as you know, when people show up, we can hand them a temporary electric fence. We have also at times invited them into the electric fence area around the ranger station so that they are safe. But that's not the best way to handle it. So this also probably entails more visitor education that we have done through our website and through our social media streams. But we can't reach everybody before they decide to land on the beach there.
Oliver, do you have a follow-up to that, or does that work?
Yeah, no, that's good. I was just thinking, some of the issues that could happen when we have non-guided people, the people that show up, boats, airplanes, the lodge support, that's all guided. And, one issue that you might see is, especially in the state side and the flats, where you have a lot of people that are moving around in separate entities instead of joining groups, or, kind of keeping the overall presence a little bit lower. Having more people that are not guided, twos and threes and fours, kind of moving around independently, with a lack of kind of oversight, just seems like it could potentially invite more conflict.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Oliver. And I think whether those visitors are coming with an air taxi, again, how we work maybe in particular with air taxi CUA permit holders to deliver some of this safety information, and when they're doing trip planning with a potential visitor, as well as folks coming in their own plane or boat, right? That's a little bit harder, but we have worked with the regional office to try and figure out where those access points might be. Is it the Sportsman's Show? Is it the General Aviation Show in the spring, where we could reach some of those folks more directly, to try and do more visitor education? Or is it, again, we just have more staffing on the ground? And this is a perfect example where if we look 10 years out, what does that private visitation potentially look like? And how do we adapt to that?
Sure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Oliver. And I apologize again for my dog getting in the way of the question. David Cardinal, the microphone is yours.
Oh, great. Oh, thanks. Yeah. Most of you don't know me, but I've been visiting and staying on the Silver Salmon Creek area, Lake Clark shore for 25 years, maybe 2 to 3 weeks a year. So I'm saying 500 nights, which is more than most people, I think. And usually the same June, July, August time every year. So I get a sense of bears. I'm there to photograph and bring people and stuff. So, but I can't say scientifically, but I do have some observations. First of all, in the 25 years, I've never seen or heard of a truly dangerous incident, either for the bear or the people, between a true guide and a bear. There have been one knucklehead who down at Shelter Creek, was worried about his daughter, but he was a fly-in fisherman. There was another 85-year-old who was feeding the bears. And, so there's outliers, but I think that the guided bear viewing has been incredibly safe. It's just, you can't even explain to people in the rest of the world how amazing and unique this is. So it is kind of incredible. And so to me, and I take people all over the world to see wildlife, and it's my favorite place. So it's unbelievably unique. I just want to make that really clear, and I just hope we can keep it that way. In terms of specifics, like there's 8 ATVs, OHVs, whatever you want to call them, but it's just a totally different thing. There are people, maybe, I don't know if the various other people off on the other side of the creek have a permit, but the guide at the lodges, only the guides can drive them. They carry trailers of people, so they can't go fast because otherwise the people are going to break their backs and sue. So they putter along, and the bears kind of don't care, and the guides stop when the bears cross the road. And it's not, the bears, over the 25 years I've been going there, there's more bears, they're more accustomed to us, they're more habituated. Now that they're not being shot by the fishermen, they're pretty happy. So I think that's important. I think another thing is I do think I'm a fan of safe camping. I'm very supportive that the various rangers over the years have gone out to the beach and talked to campers and said, maybe you should come be in the cabin, or maybe you should come be in our fence. Obviously that's not scalable. So, but having people out there makes everybody nervous, because we sort of start to feel responsible, like, hey, there's those people out there in a tent. So whatever you can do to encourage a safe camping space, I think would be great. Also, I know there's some discussion somewhere in one of the proposals about platforms. It just isn't that kind of space. I mean, that's what the OHVs or ATVs are for. It's not like Brooks. I mean, we can't just camp at the confluence or out at the windsock and hope for the best and get, it just isn't that way. That's not how the bears work, except maybe for a week during fishing season. So I don't see platforms being a great answer. I do agree that the banks of the creek get chewed up, and I'm open to suggestions on that. I mean, it's the only way to get across. The Park Service uses it. We use it when we go places. But the rest of it, I think the ATVs are pretty much confined out of the meadows, and a lot of trails have been closed. Even the Windsock Trail and stuff have been closed. And finally, I think every CUA should have a radio, and they should be required. I don't know how you do this, but like planes, if you're in a plane, you've got to respond. You have to have a radio and you have to talk to the tower. So I think that's huge. In the field, if you have a group that's doing something stupid because they don't see a bear, then you need to talk to them and they need to listen. And hand signaling is not really a great answer. So I think that could be a mandatory requirement, and the more you can do to enforce that. So sorry, it's kind of a long rant, but that's my thought.
No, I appreciate those thoughts, David, and also I smile as you talk, because I think all of us from the Park Service here really do appreciate what a unique place the Lake Clark coast is. I mean, frankly, the Cook Inlet coast, again, you get to be a national park for it being extra special, but the Cook Inlet coast is such a unique place. And as this amazing, people call it the Bear Coast, as a resource for brown bears. It's really just I guess it drives home for all of us the responsibility that we do feel, not only to protect what is there now, but again, I keep going back to, it is our jobs to look out over the horizon and try and ensure that we are well positioned to adapt to changes that could be coming, whether they are human caused through increased visitation or something else, right? So we have to ensure that we can be nimble going forward. And then I think the other thing that Alex mentioned, but I want to underscore, is every year we see many new applications for operators, for guides. And so the group of operators that we have is changing. And same thing, I think we can look out over the next 10 years. It's going to continue to change. And so I'll just say the people that we interact with most as operators on the coast are excellent, right? I mean, I have the most respect for those operators, but that things are changing. And so we're trying to think of ways that we build a better partnership with those operators, because at the number that it's at now, it's really hard to do. At 130, it's hard, especially that people are not always here, right? Trying to get they're in Birchwood, they're in Anchorage, they're in Soldotna, Kenai, Homer, trying to connect with them with our limited staff is a challenge. So we're trying to think of ways that we continue to build those best practices around bear viewing. And with that, I'll let Buck speak more to sort of what you're seeing, but you know, I'll just go back to with the number of visitors that we are seeing, the number of operators over a longer span of time, but still having one ranger on the ground, it's hard to really feel like we have it covered. And we know that growth is coming.
Thanks. I think that's true. And more ranger presence, I think, is needed just to cover both sides of the creek at high tide, if nothing else.
Yeah. Buck or Greg, do you have anything that you want to add to that answer?
I don't have a lot, Suzanne, but I did want to say that I think we're fortunate to have some of the best operators with some of the most experienced guides. And I think when you, as you have, David, have that opportunity to go out with those folks, you know, they have an innate ability through their time on site to really read animal behavior really well. And that takes time. No one gets that just kind of by reading a book. It takes experience. And I think, as Suzanne alluded to, as we get more and more operators, that level of skill and experience and local knowledge isn't something that many of them have. And so we really have to kind of shoot for the middle to some extent to ensure that, you know, those folks can still operate, do so safely, but also still hopefully let folks with more experience operate in a way that they have for a long time, in a way that's really not, you know, having any detrimental effects that we can see. And so kind of figuring out what that balance is one of the things we're going to strive to do. And it probably will come from a few different approaches, but hopefully we'll get there. Appreciate your questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I agree that's an issue. I mean, you could be like Botswana and have guide tests and levels, but I don't see us getting there anytime soon.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, the other thing is right now the tool that we have is through the commercial use authorization permit. So that's a 2-year permit. And I'll just say it doesn't have a lot of screening for operators. So and that we're just restricted in our ability under that mechanism how far we can go in screening out operators. And so there are other tools that we can use as the Park Service, and we're looking at those. The most frequently used one in the lower 48 is the concession contract, and there's 3 different tiers of a concession contract. So it could be the really big, you know, who's running the lodges at Yellowstone versus sort of the lower tier that is used more frequently for like the rafting guides on the Colorado River. And I'm looking at Alex to see if she wants to just talk for one more minute about, again, the toolbox that we have right now.
Yeah, I would just echo what Suzanne has said. You know, we are definitely limited by law. Commercial services law says, you know, a CUA is limited to this length of time and an application can ask these questions, and that's it. So we really rely on putting in stipulations at up the park, region, and national level to really try to hone in on our biggest concerns. But even then, it is difficult to oversee something as large as our program. With as much visitation as the coast is receiving, a lot of our operators are now doing multiple trips a day. So it's just gotten to a different scale than it used to be. And a concessions model is very different. We have different regulations. We have different authority over what can and cannot be done through a contract as a 10-year term. So there's a lot more stability for operators. And it limits the number of operators who can provide those visitor services. So it is a very different mechanism with different levels of control at the park level, and also a lot different levels of administrative work on both the operator and the park. So definitely something the park would need to weigh. But there are triggers for when a park should be looking really seriously at moving the type of authorization mechanism. And a lot of it comes down to resource concerns, safety concerns, which are some of the concerns this plan is speaking to.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Buck. Thank you, Suzanne, for weighing in on that. And thank you, David, for asking the question. Our next question comes from the chat. Bill Moorwinkle asks, and I think this question is probably best handled by Sarah Bodo, our project manager. Bill asks, I saw on your website that the next opportunity for civic engagement is scheduled for summer of 2025. Given that many of us are incredibly busy in the summer, can we move that to winter/spring/late fall?
Yeah, and maybe I'll ask Suzanne her thoughts. We definitely want to be sensitive to your involvement, and your involvement is so important. I will also say that sometimes planning projects the schedules shift, so there probably is an opportunity to move that earlier or later. But I also know that Suzanne has said, visitation is increasing. We need to figure this out. Like, the longer the wait, the harder it gets to make changes. So there's that as well. So Suzanne, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Bill, I hear you. I absolutely appreciate your comment, and we will look to make sure that we are working it in a way that operators and frankly just visitors can really thoroughly consider the recommendation. So I hear you. Yes, we will figure out a way to make this work for everyone.
Thank you, Suzanne.
And then I see a question here too about the different tiers. And Alex, I think if you go, well, Alex, I know, asking where you can see a description of the different tiers of concession contracts. Do you have a recommendation on that, Alex?
Yeah, that would be outlined in 36 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations 51. That's all centered around commercial services. Basically, it's concessions contracts is how it's titled, but encompasses CUAs as well. So if you look in there, we have definitions, and it does outline the tiers somewhere in this very lengthy CFR. So that's where I would start, but I'm always happy to send you something directly that can kind of just show how does a category 1 versus 2 versus 3, how is that defined? It really centers around assets. So buildings are an asset that would be managed. So with the type of visitor services we see on the coast, they would fall within a category 3 contract most likely, because it would be either a transportation type of service or a guided service, which doesn't usually have associated assets with it. So it's not tiered on like level of complexity per se, or risk or anything like that. It's really, it comes down to buildings and other assets, and how, if there are any or not, and if who's responsible for maintaining them, really is how they get categorized. Oh, it looks like Greg just dropped in the chat the link to that too.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alex. And Dee certainly do reference that link in the chat. And Alex is there if you have further questions after you refer to that. David and Joanne, I see your hand is up again. I apologize for not getting to you sooner. Please go right ahead.
Oh, that's okay. And actually, we each have a question. So David will go first here.
Oh, okay. In reference to the uniqueness of the area, again, in terms of how bears conduct their movements, in given areas, and the fact that you have different populations of bears, like for example, brooks, where they're concentrated along a waterfall. So the question is, how would you envision, getting back to the proposal of a possible distance requirement between bears and people? I'm curious how you might envision enforcing a ruling whereby a minimum distance was established, given the fact that you have roaming and ranging bears in an area and a park ranger also involved in accessing the fields there. And that curious bears will approach people, and mothers with cubs will cache sometimes their cubs close to people. So I guess I'm trying to envision, would it take a ranger, a full-time ranger with a rangefinder to continually monitor how bears and people are moving out in and out of outside of each other's orbit when you draw, arbitrary distance requirements? It was just mentioned earlier that this might be a possible solution to something dealing with bear-human potential conflicts. And do you have a vision for that?
Yeah, I'll answer really quick, and then I'll let Greg jump in as well. But this is one that we have been hearing about for years, and of course they have one on the Katmai coast, where frankly they have fewer rangers. And for whatever reason, when Katmai adopted it, Lake Clark did not. And I feel like ever since then, people have been raising it as why Lake Clark does not have one. And with all the caveats that you mentioned, David, in terms of bears approaching you, and implementing best bear viewing practices when a bear is approaching you and what you should do versus a visitor approaching a bear, right? We understand those two different dynamics when we're talking about this, but in terms of the enforcement, I will turn that over to Greg.
So sort of setting aside what distance might be in a conversation like that. In general, in places where they do have distance restrictions for approaching wildlife, Yellowstone being a pretty prominent example. In general, enforcement of things like that, like we think about the presence of the Park Service out on our coast, the number of rangers that we have versus the level of visitation. Yellowstone certainly has a lot more rangers than we do, but they also have millions of visitors a year. So the scalable to an extent. In a lot of cases, it is our non-law enforcement staff that are talking to people about or pointing out violations, I guess, of distance restrictions as an initial conversation. And I know from our own experiences at the park here, although we don't have distance restrictions, we do try and encourage people to follow best practices and stay a reasonable distance from the bears. And for our non-LE staff at both Silver Salmon and, non-law enforcement staff at Silver Salmon and Chinitna, we have had conversations with visitors there, or they have, where they're pointing out and they're asking visitors with guides, hey, you're too close to this animal, let's give it some space. And the response has been, there's no regulation that says that I have to, and you can't make me. Which in general, for the type of relationship that we're trying to have with operators out there is probably not the best way to engage in that conversation. So we don't want to fix a problem that we're not having, but if we looked at something like this down the road, what I would envision is something along the lines of the non-law enforcement staff are able to make that approach. If that's the response that they get back, well, obviously that's not right. There is a regulation. If the law enforcement staff are out on the coast there and enforcing a distance regulation, that's generally not going to look like we're standing there with a rangefinder all the time, making sure that somebody is, if it's 100 yards, that they're not 99 yards away from that bear. It's going to be, hey, you're 50 yards from that bear, you're 60 yards from that bear. Like there's a common sense step off to most of this type of enforcement. And there's a risk in being too close to the line for us when we do try to enforce it, in terms of engaging with the court system, people's due process and so forth. So does that get to your point at all?
That's fine for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Suzanne. Joanne, take us home.
Okay, thank you. First, thanks for arranging this and thanks for listening to us. Obviously, it's all really important to us. And Buck, thanks for overseeing all the research projects and keeping science in this. I have to say we had a lot of questions about the bear stress study as we spent a lot of time with your young man that was doing that out there, and we're really looking forward to talking to you more about that and any conclusions that might come from it. But I think it's probably best to wait till that actually gets published, and then maybe offline we can just discuss it with you, just depending on how important that study is going to be. So again, thank you. Thanks for all the science you do. And Suzanne, the question I had was regarding the bear viewing platforms. Is the purpose of that to allow folks to sit down that aren't able to stand in the field for a long period, or is a thought that it would eventually replace the ability of folks to be able to walk into the meadows? I mean, what's the purpose of it?
Well, like I said during the presentation, one purpose is to create an area that is more accessible to a wider range of visitors. So that's one goal. And just because some of the walking there now is challenging, so we recognize that. And I will say the bear viewing areas at Chinitna have been successful. We recently did some pretty significant maintenance to the trail there, and you're going through a forested area to two of those bear viewing areas. So we did significant maintenance to the trail to access it, but they have worked well in creating a place where you have safety, but also a good line of sight to the meadows for bear viewing. So at Silver Salmon, again, we are out there talking to the public now to get feedback on this. So I don't want to prejudge that in saying where they would go or what they would or would not replace, but to get people's comments on whether or not that would be a good addition at Silver Salmon. Or additional ones at Chinitna too, like I said.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Joanne. David Cardinal, I see your hand is up. We are almost out of time, but feel free to ask your question or leave it in the chat, whatever works better for you, sir.
Oh, sure. Just a few seconds. That interaction that Gregory described with the guide just makes me a little sad, because if any of the guides I've worked with or did that, that'd be pathetic. So even if there is or isn't a guideline, the more we can educate and require in the CUA or development contract that the guides, it's like, okay, if a person asks you about distance from bears, it's tricky. We all know that. But, you don't just say, oh, there's no rule, pound sand. I mean, it's like, okay, that's why we're here. They're there. We're doing this. You want to join us? I mean, people have to be welcoming and friendly and opening. And if they're not, I hope we can get them to not be in the park, frankly. But obviously, that's easier said than done. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you for everyone who asked questions and engaged in this question and answer session.
All right. So I just want to wrap up really quickly here. So tonight, as you probably know, we have another public meeting, virtual public meeting. The presentation will be exactly the same as the one you just saw. You are welcome to join us at that time. We have heard, I think at least one person said they're coming, and if you want to join for the discussion, I think our presentation took about 50 minutes today, so you could even try joining at like kind of the tail end of that. However, I really appreciate your questions. I think you asked a lot of great clarifying questions and really good discussion. And we look forward to seeing your comments come in and working with you as we continue with this planning process. So with that, Suzanne, any final words before we say goodbye to folks?
No, we'll just start back at the beginning where I want to say thank you to everyone who participated today. It's very nice to see several of you that usually I won't see until July or August. And I guess I want to underscore that we are at the beginning of the process here. We do want to get your comments. We want to get your ideas. Certainly, again, what we have put out there are considered to be conversation prompts. So don't limit yourself to just commenting on what you have seen so far in the documents, but please bring forward your ideas too. Because again, collectively, just knowing the people that are on this call, there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience that we, the Park Service, can gain from. So if there's a different recommendation that you want to put on the table, please do that.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Great. With that,
You.
have a wonderful
Thank you.
afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.